Well, good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and welcome to Global Insights, a live interactive panel discussion which sheds light on big questions currently facing policymakers, planners, and researchers worldwide. Global Insights features experts from leading schools of international affairs, including the Balsillie School in Canada, Warwick University in the UK, Konstanz University in Germany, and the American University in Washington, DC. Today's live stream production is entitled Democratic versus Undemocratic Protests. My name is Anne Fitzgerald, and I'm delighted to be moderating this session. A warm welcome to all participants in the audience, and there are many of you today. If you do have a question, please feel free to log it on the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom panel. We'll do our best to channel it to the appropriate panelists, especially towards the end of the session. Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. For those in the audience tuning in from outside of Canada today, one of the actions that we take here in Canada to advance reconciliation between settler and Indigenous peoples is to reflect on our relationship with the land and the continuous process of colonization, which deeply impacts our work. Acknowledging the land is a process of deliberately naming that this is Indigenous land and that Indigenous people have rights to this land. The Balsillie School sits on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations, which is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. It's particularly important that we here at the school acknowledge this land in all that we do, including our Global Insights panels. To start off today's conversation, let's turn to our distinguished panel. Erin Francis is a PhD candidate in the Global Governance Program at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Prior to joining the Balsillie School, Erin spent several years directing political relations at the University of Waterloo. As a founder and curator, Erin has exhibited works from his Vintage Black Canada initiative at the Band Gallery in Toronto, the Gladstone Hotel, and the Contact Photography Festival. Most recently in June, Erin co-organized and marshaled the Kitchener-Waterloo Region's Solidarity March for Black Lives Matter that saw an estimated 30,000 attendees. Agustina Girardi is an associate professor of political science at the American University. Her work addresses debates on subnational and national democratic and semi-authoritarian regimes and subnational politics in the Americas. She has published numerous books and journal articles on these topics. Mandeep Tivana is Chief Programs Officer at Civicus, the Global Civil Society Alliance. He specializes in legislation relating to the core civil society freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. Since joining Civicus in 2008, Mandeep has engaged in efforts to advance civil society participation in decision-making and to protect civil society freedoms globally. He's written extensively on this subject, particularly between relationships between civil society, sustainable development, and international relations. Thanks everyone for coming and sharing your insights with us today. The global pandemic, COVID-19, has become the backdrop to mass protests around the world. Some of the protests have championed progressive and liberal causes, such as greater social justice, an end to systemic racism, and the protection of democratic rights, and have by and large been peaceful. But others have been distinctly repressive and illiberal, led by those who are prepared to use violence to advance racist and nativist agenda. And the storming of the US Capitol building on January 6, 2021, being the most brazen example of these counterforces to date. Erin, let's start with you and ask, in a democracy, what is the difference between a democratic and undemocratic protest?
Thanks, Anne. The short answer is that there is no difference. It's an interesting dichotomy, but I'm not sure it is an accurate one. In a democracy governed by the rule of law, all protests are democratic. It's only the state's response that can deem them otherwise, in my humble opinion. I think of the G20 protests in Toronto in 2010, which was deemed to have, the police response, for example, was deemed to have violated human rights. And more recently, I think of the US federal government's use of unmarked police officers in Seattle, for example. Now, certainly, like the challenge in having this conversation, we have to acknowledge that protest is often in itself a challenge to prevailing social contracts. So there is a tendency for some of these movements to be criminalized. But what I'm talking about is not rioting. I'm not talking about looting. I'm not talking about destruction of public property by any means. I'm talking about a lawful right to assemble, and in which case, in a democracy, it's always a democratic practice.
Thank you. Agustina, over to you. What is the connection in your view between protests and populism?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this wonderful panel and to discuss this very pressing problem that affects us all. So one thing that I wanted to highlight is that many of the protests, the most violent ones that we are seeing, are taking place in countries that are ruled by populist leaders. And we should not forget that populist leaders, by definition, even by default, they distrust existing political institutions. They have this fascination with appealing directly to the masses. So in previous days, we had Juan Domingo Perón in Argentina addressing the masses from the balcony. Today, we have Donald Trump addressing the masses via Twitter. We have Jair Bolsonaro addressing the masses directly through YouTube on a very regular basis. So we see a systematic bypassing of existing institutions. And as a result of that, populist leaders tend to stoke protests. They like to rally people and to take them out to the streets. Here, I would like to make a distinction as well between, try to unpack a little bit this more. And populist leaders can be left-leaning or right-leaning, right? And some of these protests might be pro-democratic and some others might be anti-democratic. So by default, there is not something that we would predict that a populist leader will engage in an anti-democratic protest, right? Or that he or she will stoke an anti-democratic protest. We can think of some very popular leaders in the 40s and 50s that were rallying people to extend democracy, right? So the incorporation of workers into the political arena, that was a fairly pro-democratic protest led by a populist leader. What we have today in the case of Trump in the US or Bolsonaro in Brazil or Erdogan in Turkey, those are populist leaders with a clear anti-democratic agenda that are using the masses to engage in anti-democratic protests to subvert democracy in a way.
Thank you. Mandeep, over to you. How would you describe the current global trajectory of protest movements? Is there anything particularly unique about where we are at the moment?
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to this conversation. It's really interesting where the conversation is proceeding, and I'm going to speak from the perspective of a global civil society alliance that is, that works on social justice and rights issues. So if we look at the last decade, the protests are oftentimes against power that's been assumed. So I would say if protest leaders are already in power, I would classify that protest slightly differently. When a populist politician who's a prime minister or a president brings out their base, it's different in a sense, because those protesters already have the state apparatus to protect them, or they already have a social extremist fringe to safeguard them and provide a safety net for them. But if we look at the last decade or so, a lot of protests have been against power, and here I would classify protests into four large categories. One is protest for livelihood. We found that in recent times, inequality has increased a lot. A lot of states are outsourcing their basic responsibilities to private entities. So there's collusion between political and economic elites that has led to the manufacturing of extreme poverty or deprivation in a time of monumental creation of wealth and technological advance. So here are people who are fighting for their livelihoods against big corporations, against high-level corruption that happens, and they're frustrated and they come out on the streets. Then there's protest for equality. And here is, for example, if we look at the Me Too movement, the fight for gender equality, the fight by LGBTI groups to demand equal rights against discrimination, and most importantly, more recently, the Black Lives Matter protests, which have again, brought the issue of racial justice to the fore. So those are on equality. And then is the protest for voice. We have a global democratic deficit around the world, where and this came to fore during the protests that happened in Middle East and North Africa and spread to Sub-Saharan Africa. Sometimes you refer to as the Arab Spring, I would say wrongly so in a sense, but those are protests where people come up against authoritarian leaders, where they want their rights. They protest against authoritarian systems because they want to be part of the decisions that impact their lives. And then there are protests for the future, the Fridays for Future protests by young people who are demanding a say in environmental policies, who are concerned about their future and about the future of humanity itself. But in the present moment, and as Augustina also referred, we have a very challenging situation. You have old school authoritarianism on one hand, where these leaders want to control power. They want to use all the levers of crude levers of power, mixed with the zero-sum game electoral politics of populist leaders who basically, once they get elected, don't care about the people who didn't vote them to power or their bases. So I might have exceeded my time, but thank you for that.
Thank you. Politics has always been a divisive game, but it seems to be much more polarized today than ever, especially if one is comparing it with 5 or 10 years ago. And the space for peaceful protest seems to be shrinking as well. You mentioned repressive and authoritative regimes. This week we mark the 10-year anniversary of what has been a devastating and destructive war in Syria, which started in 2011 by way of protest activity. Augustina, I want to come back to you and ask, what role does polarization play in these mass protests?
Thank you. Well, first of all, polarization is not new, right? So polarization has existed since we all have a memory. What is new today is the pace with which polarization is taking place. And I think that the role of the internet and social media is key here. And I hope that we have some time to touch upon that later. But when societies are highly polarized, and polarization can be a result of many different issues, right? So it could be a result of religious differences, immigration differences, racial divisions, ethnic divisions. So there are multiple reasons for why a country can be polarized. People, those who are not represented by whomever is in power, tend to feel left out. They don't trust in the institutions that are in a way co-opted by those who are part of the opposite pole. And therefore, instead of channeling their demands through existing institutions, they decide to go out to the streets. And those are the type of protests I think that Mandip was referring to, right? So initially I was talking about the people who go out to the streets in a more top-down manner, right? Controlled by these autocrats, populist leaders who want to rally the people out. Here, I think that when we talk about polarization, we also need to pay attention to how the other pole that is not in power is feeling left out without no possibility of using existing institutions, semi-democratic institutions or democratic institutions, and they decide to take their voices out to the street. So there is an intricate connection between high levels of polarization, which we are seeing everywhere in the world. All regions of the world are experiencing that, and the increasing amount of protests, both democratic and anti-democratic, that we are seeing as well.
Erin, as someone who's led more than 20,000 people in peaceful protests, such as this past summer in downtown Kitchener, What philosophical challenges did you have to confront in advance of organizing this protest?
So, I mean, for just some context for the viewers and listeners, that was the first protest or demonstration I had personally participated in from an organizational standpoint, and only the second one just from an individual standpoint. But the timing was such, we're going back a year now in my hometown of Kitchener-Waterloo. We're going back a year now, and so the timing is such that nonetheless, like, we were driven to stand in solidarity. And as it turned out, the majority of my town, my city folk, they were too. We had more than 20,000, probably upwards to 30,000 people march peacefully in solidarity. We, as an organizing committee, had to balance different thoughts and approaches, different ideas along the political spectrum to find consensus. And in terms of the philosophies, I would say we were in agreement that we were not asking permission to demonstrate. And I think that is, for myself personally, as someone that views themselves as law-abiding, that was a challenge for myself. Well, we can't just simply stop traffic or disrupt, the local economy for a couple of hours. These are the initial thoughts that one has, but one finds that certain times, certain mass actions are deemed acceptable. And more to that point, then it became paramount that we cooperate, or at least myself in the capacity as marshal, that I would cooperate with emergency services. And so I wasn't just randomly stepping out into traffic. We had a predestined route, and we got assistance from some of the folks that were the subject of the demonstration. They were assisting us in making sure that it was safe, and it went without incident. So at the end of the day, fascinatingly, as academics, I will say practicality took over, and almost the idea of the sort of luxury of philosophy disappears in those moments. And maybe really it's just, you have to confront what's in front of you, and especially when it comes to safety and security of people in one's town. So really it's a civic responsibility that took hold for myself in that very moment.
Mandeep, Civicus, a well-known organization known for its work in understanding and responding to global civic space challenges, which adversely impact civil society seeking change. How would you describe global civic conditions at the moment?
So, as I mentioned, this toxic mix of old school authoritarianism and zero-sum game populist politics, which combines with economic elites' interests, is really creating a very challenging situation around the world, where the core civic freedoms of peaceful assembly, expression, and association, which are part of the constitutions of almost every country and are part of customary international law. These three freedoms, in our research through the Civicus Monitor, which is a participatory platform that looks at civic freedoms around the world, finds that as many as 87% of the world's population live in countries with adverse civic space conditions. In fact, a quarter of the world's population live in countries with absolutely closed civic space, where speaking truth to power, where exposing high-level corruption can land you in prison and worse. And this group of countries is extremely large. It stretches from China to Cuba, a large rump in Middle East and North Africa region. And it remains a challenge for any civic activities to promote gender justice, to promote youth participation, to promote democratic values, to promote inclusion and protection of minorities. And that's is a challenge. Increasingly, we are finding that despite the fact that the right to peaceful mobilization allowed the women's right to vote, it enabled decolonization, it enabled civil rights, it's put the climate emergency on the international radar, that peaceful protesters are now being confronted with security legislation. The counter-terror discourse is being repurposed by authoritarian leaders to actually attack the right to peaceful protest as they seek to keep power. So global civic space situation is extremely challenging if you are seeking a change in power relations around the world or seeking to protect the rights of minority populations or disadvantaged or excluded groups.
So whether we're discussing Black Lives Matter protests or pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong, Myanmar, mass demonstrations and activism are, of course, a global phenomenon. So Aaron, I want to come back to you and ask, how are protest movements redefining democracy in your view in North America and around the world?
It's taking place in many ways, but the manner which fascinates me the most is the exacerbated strains between subnational and national relations. And what I mean to say is federal governments, provincial governments, disagreeing on so much and having to sort of take sides when it comes to a mass movement. So think of the U.S. federal government having to send again the National Guard or others into Seattle, much to the chagrin of the governor of the state at the time. These strained relations are occurring not only in North America. I think Hong Kong and China is a decent example from the Far East, and then even here, like the land back movement in Canada, where we have sovereign First Nations. And essentially this interaction between the federal governments, or again, these different levels of jurisdictions, having to decide where they stand on a particular protest movement. Those are specific examples. Generally though, something caught my eye. There's this neat little index that the Economist Intelligence Unit does. And sadly, most recently, they were sharing some data from this index, and in every category, democracy, every category they use to define democracy, it's trending downwards around the world, right across the board, except one, and that was political participation. And political participation taking place, yes, in the form of voting, of course, but also they were engaging participation in mass movements and protests. And that was the only manner that which democracy saw an increase, at least according to this index. So I found that fascinating.
Mandeep, you're based in Civicus's New York UN liaison office. So what role do you play for the international system and the UN in particular in relation to people's mobilizations?
So the UN was formed 75 years ago. It was formed in response to fascism. It was in response to carnage, which resulted from gross human rights violations and crimes against humanity. So I would really say the UN is expected to be the conscience of the world. It really is the scaffolding upon which our rights and our humanity rests. And here I would say the UN has very important roles to play. Achievement of these roles is still a work in progress for the UN, I would say, and the UN still has much to do. But I would say there's three things that are really important. You know, when important crackdowns happen, or like what's happening in Myanmar, right? First, speak up. The UN needs to speak clearly and as the voice and conscience of the world. When gross violations of rights are taking place, when protesters are being attacked or massacred or being persecuted in ways. The second is the UN has a vast panoply of accountability measures. You know, it's got several human rights systems, it's got mechanisms. Those mechanisms need to kick in so that there's accountability, so that those who are issuing the orders and those who are doing the violations of rights, they know that they will be held accountable in the long run. And thirdly, it's important that the UN various activities that work, you know, whether the UN is engaged in humanitarian work, whether the UN is engaged in sustainable development activities, peace and security activities, all of those are done through the prism of a rights-based approach. And human rights are placed front and center. But we all know the UN has its own challenges, and sometimes the UN officials will tell you that actually it's the member states, you know, that prevent them from doing their work. There's the P5, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, whose inability or whose intransigence or their commitment to very narrowly defined geopolitical interests have caused a huge amount of carnage in the world. In Syria and Yemen are two, you know, exhibit A and exhibit B. But in this situation, I would say UN officials have a very high responsibility, and that begins right from the top, to speak loudly and strongly in favor of rights and in favor of the UN's founding values. The Charter of the United Nations speaks about respect for human dignity, equality, and to create conditions under international law for justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Augustina, what do these protests mean in your view for the future of democracy?
Well, protests in and of themselves are very good for democracy, right? If we want a thriving democracy, we want people to be engaged, we want people to participate, we want people to come together and rally out in the street. So I think that protests in and of themselves are very good for democracy. The problem here is the content of the protests, right? And so if those protests are going to be led by anti-system people, by racist people, by people who want the reduction of rights instead of an expansion of political, economic, social rights, then that becomes very, very problematic for democracy. And the question there is, how do we tolerate those groups of people who do not want to support democracy? But here I want to jump to one of the things that Aaron brought up a bit ago. We know that democracy plays out differently at different levels of government, right? So we have tons of examples, and my research is on that, of countries that are nominally democracies. But when you look at what's going on at the subnational level, we do find that many states and provinces or departments, they are ruled by highly authoritarian rulers, right? So protests that can happen or take place in regions, subnational regions that are very democratic, have the potential eventually of scaling up and be a stop to the advancement of these national autocratic leaders, right? So there is a lot of hope that comes from what's going on in the municipalities, at the state level, at the provincial level, in countries that are semi-democratic or autocratic. On the other hand, there's a lot of concern, especially when we see what's going on in the United States, when we look at what is going on at the subnational level in this country, right? So the majority of the anti-democracy movement is coming from the states. At the national level, the US seems to have turned the page to a more democratic system, yet what we are seeing at the subnational level is highly worrying. We see a lot of attempts to undermine democratic institutions in many states in the United States. So when thinking about democracy and the future of democracy, it's always very important to look at this from different levels of government and not see this as a unitary national level problem or solution.
It's a great point. In the 1990s, following the end of the Cold War, there were massive efforts on the part of the West to promote democracy. And yet in the last 2 decades, we've witnessed some fairly significant democratic backsliding in much of the world, and even in countries that are considered to be strong or healthy democracies. So is the future of democracy in question? I mean, over the last few days, we've seen the United Arab Emirates put some recommendations on the table over Syria and say that the Arab League should be inviting Syria back in, and that the only way forward is to help restore the economy and work with private sector and businesses. And this is leaving a lot of people around the world with their mouths open, gasping for air. So Augustine, I want to push back to you again. How is the polarization a major cause for democratic backsliding?
Well, this is a topic on which there seems to be a lot of consensus among political scientists. And this is a great thing because we are not always on the same page. But many scholars argue that polarization is a key factor that leads to democratic backsliding. So, and the reasoning is the following. When you have two very extreme different poles, when societies are highly divided, it's very, very difficult to come to a consensus about how to govern, right? And so effective democratic governance seems to be quite impossible in highly societies. When the government, as a result of that, is completely ineffective to provide, to deliver, to provide services and basic public goods to the people, people tend to start distrusting institutions because those governments are not efficient anymore. And so you have a first part of the population, a first variable there, a first factor there, the population, being completely distrustful of the democratic system because the democratic system is not delivering, right? The democratic system is not providing what the citizens want. And also polarization is a major factor to for those anti-system movements and parties and leaders who want to take hold on power and rule in a way that is very very authoritarian, in the sense that it does not incorporate the demands from the other group. So there is an intrinsic relationship between polarization and democratic backsliding for these two reasons. First of all, those who are not represented feel that those institutions are not delivering, and this creates mistrust. And on the other hand, there is more opportunity for anti-system leaders or parties to come up and hold onto power.
Thank you. Mandeep, what are some of the practical ways in which Civicus, as a global civil society alliance, is working to support people's struggles around the world?
So we use a multiplicity of approaches, right from participatory research to policy analysis to emergency resourcing in some instances, to strategic convenings, to coalition building. But most importantly, what we focus on is global solidarity. It's really powerful when activists who are being persecuted for speaking their truth to power or for working in the better interests of society find that in their struggles, they're not alone. So, when activists in the Philippines who are challenging the harsh edge of the state know that the same challenges are being faced by activists in India who are challenging populist right-wing politics, know that that activists in Egypt who are imprisoned because of their work can make common cause with activists in Tanzania who are taking on long-standing corruption, know that activists in Nicaragua are fighting the same good fight for a better, equal, fairer, more humane country. It's very, very powerful. So in our work at Civicus, the power of global solidarity is enormous. It's when people know that they can gain strength and courage from people around the world and use the international system, use universal rights framework, which has evolved over time and which takes the best of our cultural and humanitarian and human essences from our society, from our societies, and that really is the essence of what Civicus does: global solidarity for rights and justice and equality.
Thank you. Aaron, what's the largest challenge in your view to ensure a government's response to a process is always, or to a protest is always democratic?
Certainly it's technology. It has been of late, and I think moving forward, the challenges associated with technology and enabling or disabling democracy are growing realer and realer. I think of the disproportionate usage of facial recognition software, tracking software, predictive algorithms. It provides an incentive for actors and governments to be undemocratic. And I believe we've seen the rise of certain applications such as Signal, or previously WhatsApp, because they purported to provide anonymity for those that would challenge the status quo. University of Toronto Citizen Lab has done some work documenting the intersections of the technology, protest movements, and the surveillance of citizens, the unlawful surveillance of citizens. So it is a challenge. It's a real challenge right now. There are a good number of articles you can read about IMSI catchers, for example, that are being utilized by various police forces to monitor cell tower communications. And then on the flip side, technology really gives tech companies, obviously, an undue influence on our democratic process. In many ways, we could go on about that, but I think I would say most recently, I found that the social media ban on President Trump to be problematic, or insofar as that I believe that, again, this idea of undue influence on our democratic processes. So the challenge of technology is palpable.
There's no shortage of threats, sadly, to our democratic institutions. To name a few, we're confronting election interference by foreign actors, misinformation campaigns, and the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories, emboldened hate groups, and what many are now calling digital authoritarianism that's abled by, as you say, Aaron, surveillance technologies. So it's hard to know where to even begin addressing some of these issues. Mandeep, tell us what keeps you up at night about these global challenges.
The existence of prisoners of conscience in the 21st century. That really is a blot on our civilizational humanity. And we find in democracies and hybrid regimes, and of course in authoritarian systems, that activists who are fighting for inclusive values, people who wouldn't hurt a fly, are now being conflated with anti-terror risks and security concerns, and being put into prison and persecuted because of their work and their beliefs. That, I think, really is something that really troubles me. It troubles me that despite all the progress we claim to have made civilizationally, that the right to a fair trial, that the motivation of that politically motivated trials to persecute people who are seeking better politics, or more equal societies, or an end to discrimination, are still taking place. That people still have to spend time away from their families, in abysmal prison conditions, because they ask for basic things like rights, justice, equality, inclusion, secularism, and the freedom of religion and belief, and that really is what really keeps me awake. And we are finding that increasingly within our orbit at Civicus, that politically motivated prosecutions appear to be on the rise, in many parts of the world, and in all sorts of countries. This is not just an issue that is endemic to Eritrea or North Korea. This is something that is happening in many countries which claim to have resilient democratic systems and institutions and judiciaries and so on.
Aaron Francis, what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, I'm still thinking about like my assignments due next week. That's what keeps me up at night, just to bring a little levity. You know what? I'm going to be honest. I'm very hopeful and I'm very optimistic, and I've never been this hopeful and optimistic, because we're having conversations. There's a global consciousness, and my colleagues have spoken about it today, of right and wrong, and we see it, and we're speaking towards it, and speaking truth to power, and we're given more and more tools to do so, and to have these conversations in more nuanced ways. And so, for myself, I'm actually looking forward to the progress that we're making as a society.
And Agustina, same question to you. What's keeping you up at night, based on what your research evidence is suggesting?
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe unrelated to my research, but the increasing economic inequality that this pandemic has made even more visible keeps me up at night. I am from Latin America, and what we are seeing right now in terms of how devastating the pandemic has been, it's really bothering. In terms of our conversation and the challenges that we have discussed today, I think the fact that democracy is under attack attack is something that worries me quite a lot. I also try to be hopeful and optimistic, as Aaron said. I do believe that democracy is much weaker than we had thought it was, but yet we have so many tools right now to fix it. And so in that sense, I am hopeful that in the current state of affairs, we have many things that will prevent further democratic backsliding in so many parts of the world.
Thank you very much. I want to turn to some of the questions that are coming in through a number of different feeds here at the moment. I want to start with one on the Q&A panel. To all panelists, half a century ago, a prominent Canadian Conservative leader commented that the growth of civic movements and lobby organizations using demonstration and public pressure to achieve policy goals was, above all, an indictment of the growing irrelevance of political parties as vehicles for change, reform, and social progress, even in parliamentary democracies. So would our panelists agree with this assessment, and would they think that the situation has become worse over the last century in democracies generally? Mandeep, can I put that to you first, please?
That's a good question, but if you ask me, I'm in favor of multi-party democracy, because if we doing away with political parties probably can end up being one-party state, and we all know the damage that one-party states, or where the dominance of one single political party has caused. So, of course, we must explore ways to have direct democracy, but I do feel that political parties are essential, in a sense, to build pressure for reform and change, and to accommodate, divergent interests. That's also the beauty of democracy, of people coming together and being able to debate different things, but to be able to do it in peaceful, respectful, and dignified ways is critical. If our political parties could do that, we would live in a democratic utopia, I'm sure.
Augustina, what do you think? Do away with political parties?
As a political scientist, I have to say no, of course. But no, I think that it's a very interesting question, and the answer depends on what country of the world you're looking at, right? So we know that in Latin American countries, parties have become very corrupt. They don't represent what they should be representing, and so the discussion of having or not parties could make more sense there than perhaps in other democracies. But I would say that we need more parties. In a highly polarized society in which we live pretty much in all regions of the world, and let me give you the example of the United States, there is no way that a democracy will function efficiently with only two parties. We're talking about one of the most diverse countries in terms of religion, ideology, ethnicity, immigration. There's no way in the world that a democracy with only two parties would be able to represent all those voices. So in the US, I would say we need at least 4 parties. And so I think that the discussion is not about abolishing parties, but maybe perhaps thinking about what incentives, institutional incentives we can put out there so that the party becomes multi-party, the party system becomes multi-party. Of course, having tons of parties is a problem as well. So we need to find a middle range, right? So having more than 40 parties like you have in Brazil might be too problematic as well. But 2 parties in such a big democracy like the US with so much diversity, I don't see how that can work.
Aaron, any thoughts on that from a Canadian perspective?
Sure, briefly. I mean, Augustina makes a great point. We do need a democratic party process that is more representative of what the people want. I think if you look at the last 20 years of sort of perpetual protest, as long as I can remember, at least every 2 years, there is a new movement speaking truth to power. And I think that's indicative of the inability for our party process or our policymaking process to absorb what people want and to facilitate the needs and wants to be a functioning democracy. I think that's what it's indicative of. So certainly something like more parties proportional representation would be helpful. In my own example, I've worked with every single political party. I always will. So there is a certain banality to the ideologies that separate them all. And if one has a true civic heart and love, right?
Yeah. You spoke about technology earlier as well. There's a number of questions coming in about how technology is being leveraged both to enable and stifle protests and democratic human rights. What, in your view, Aaron, can be done to address the latter, i.e. the stifling?
Stifling. I don't know that a stifling has occurred. I think that, as I said before, I believe that these platforms, it's two sides to this coin. It creates a forum for avarice and all sorts of bad people to say what they want to say, but it also creates an opportunity for nuanced conversations and for people that were perhaps on the fringe or marginalized to have a centralized voice in some of these discussions. So I think I'm not sure if I can agree that this muting is occurring.
So I work a lot in the Horn of Africa and Sudan included, and on the lead up to the deposing of Omar al-Bashir. And Mandeep, I'd love your thoughts on this. Those platforms were used indeed to stifle protests on WhatsApp, on Signal, on Viber. Threats were issued by certain areas of the government, certain security institutions in the government, to warn people of things that would come to them, and some perfectly believable things, like there was foreign insurgents planting bombs in a certain neighborhood, etc. And that would keep people off the streets. You know, for those who did show up, they would be grabbed in the first half hour, brought down to the various precincts and police stations, be questioned and allowed to go. And that was a form of stifling as well, because the government could argue that their rights to peaceful protests were being respected, but they just wanted to make sure things were going the right way. But of course, nobody went back on the streets afterwards. So Mandeep, anything about the technology that's stifling and enabling these days?
The technology is a double-edged sword. I mean, technology has really enabled activists, in far corners of the world to, document and violations of rights. It's also allowed them to engage with others, to tell their stories, to make momentum for change, and it has been hugely enabling in that sense. But whenever there's technology, or whenever there's a strong movement for change, you often see there's a counter reaction. And actually, one of the biggest threats to activism at the moment is this ramping up of censorship, surveillance, and disinformation. And and all of this is really accentuated in the context of COVID-19 too, where emergency measures were introduced in many parts of the world, and censorship remains a huge issue, where where leaders who want to control the political narrative intimidate journalists, engage in internet shutdowns, and also basically control the airwaves and the media, and that's a huge challenge. They scrub in fact, their firewalls, and scrubbing of information of the internet remains a real challenge to the people's right to access credible information upon which their decision makers are taking decisions that are impacting their lives. Surveillance is another huge issue. And in fact, here again, it's a classic example of how the counter-terror discourse has been used to actually, in the name of the people, is being used to suppress the people. And it's a huge challenge where activists who speak, who expose rights violations, how they are being surveilled through, digitally surveilled, their right to privacy is being eroded. I think the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and opinion has been doing some work on this, and it's an emerging area of work on what are the limits of privacy, and how, without any legal safeguards, it's almost like a wild west out there of surveillance of private communications. And I would not dealing this with disinformation, because all of this is happening again because of this, this growth of these populist politics and authoritarianism, how propaganda and disinformation are being used as important tools to, again, to sow confusion in society, to promote hate-filled extremist nationalist ideologies that are antithetical to the human interactions that have happened over millennia. People have moved and gained through information and cultures and absorb different things. Yet you find that the nationalist discourses oftentimes fall into very narrowly defined parameters of what societal and cultural norms should be, and that's done through disinformation and propaganda.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's not just the activists that are getting threatened, right? Or the journalists. It's any kind of analyst, an academic, etc. And so yes, these internet armies.
I just wanted to raise another important point. I think gender justice activists, the harassment that is happening on the internet, the sexual violence and threats and intimidation that happens, particularly against those who are fighting for women's equality or for LGBTQI rights, is particularly acute.
Yeah. Agustina, talk to me about your views on this issue, because it's rife in Latin America as well. I mean, should we just get the elephant out of the room and say, here's what governments need to do? It sounds crazy, but here's what international organizations and governments need to do. I mean, is it ban Twitter? Is it develop an international organization for internet governance to put some rules on some of these organizations? What is it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to second what Mandeep and Aaron have said about how technology or internet has become a double-edged sword, right? So these technologies, and not technologies, but social media, internet, have become extremely important for creating what Mandeep referred to, this global solidarity, right? So the problems that I'm having right now in Rio Negro, Argentina, are the same ones as the person who is living in Africa, in Nigeria. So that is wonderful, that it creates more solid networks of solidarity and organization that can make more contributions and more sophisticated contributions for the advancement of political and other rights. Yet, on the other hand, we have the example that you just provided, and in which the usage of social media, or in particular WhatsApp, the text messaging apps, is stifling the participation of people in politics. And I think that here it's very important, and this is a discussion that is way more advanced in the US and in Europe, to start regulating these companies. I mean, to me, these companies, this is a debate that was long overdue. It has to happen. Up to now, we did not know exactly what the effect of these social media networks and the internet was on protests and polarization and democracy. Now we know very well what they can and what they cannot do. And so a more sophisticated discussion about regulating the internet world, the online world, is needed. I also want to highlight that some of these companies have already taken steps to address some of these issues. So you have Facebook creating this Supreme Court made up of experts that is gonna decide what content can be published or not on Facebook. You have other apps like TikTok also creating a council of experts in which they are going to monitor what type of content is put on these platforms or not. And then you also have Twitter trying to revisit what they have done right and wrong in the past, so that they can provide a more secure environment in those networks. But I think that, I mean, of course, governments have to step up and do something about it. And I think, of course, that's going to be a tricky one, because if you have an authoritarian leader stepping up to regulate the content of what can be published online, that can be very problematic. But here I'm counting on all countries of the world coming together to try to come up with a reasonable way of regulating what's going on in the online world.
Thank you. Menti, just very quickly on this question, does the arc of history bend towards justice, in your view?
Certainly, if you, I mean, there is so much progress that's happened. I mean, on equality, on decolonization, on, creating more cohesive societies, yes, but we have to be patient. It takes time and it takes public mobilizations. And that's really something that, where global solidarity over people working together and need to draw heart from that, the South African apartheid state was a very strong one, but people's mobilizations ensured that that evil system was finally shattered.
Thank you very much. To all the panelists, very quickly, 15 seconds each, what would be your top tip to the policymakers, especially those who are in the audience today? Aaron, we'll start with you.
Engage with these technology companies, perhaps in response to one of your earlier questions, and I believe the future of democracy is being decided in terms of these interactions, policymakers currently and the technology companies, and I would love to see a greater level of engagement.
Thank you. Mandeep, top tip for the policy world.
They should invest in people-centered multilateralism. I mean, be true to the values of the UN Charter, the international system, and also conceive your national interest in long-term views. Short-term geopolitical interest it doesn't serve a country's interest for a very long time. If they look international values, international norms, they actually contribute to a country's long-term interest. I would also say practice at home what you preach abroad. That's very important because a number of Western democracies, used their moral influence and talk about human rights very selectively. So that needs to change. And lastly, I would just say, be brave, be true to call out abuse of power wherever it might occur, and use the the safeguards that are there, such as whistleblower legislation and so on, to do your job in the best way it's intended.
Thank you. Augustina, top tips for the policy world.
Pay attention to the interactions that take place across levels of governments. Don't be fooled that now that Trump is gone, democracy in the US has become stronger. No, what's going on in Georgia, what's going on in Alabama, what's going on in Kentucky is even more worrying than what we saw a couple of weeks ago. So be mindful of how democracy plays out at different levels of government.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for what I'm sure everybody in the audience will agree was a great session and a great way to wrap up season 3 of Global Insights. We hope you all enjoyed it. Please join us for a very special episode on Thursday, April 15th, featuring graduate students from the United States, from Canada, and from the UK, providing their insights on global issues. Until then, thanks so much. Take care and stay safe.